on the phone, I believe we have Emily Dooley from Newsday. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Bill. How you doing?
Oh, it's so nice to know you're there. I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Happy it's Friday.
Yes, amen, right? So I see the story we have here. We're talking about the impact of Hurricane Sandy on the Fire Island kind of ecosystem. Well, why don't you tell us about the story? You did the work.
Well, so after Superstorm Sandy, there were 3 breaches cut through Fire Island, and 2 were kind of immediately closed up by the Army Corps. And a third was in a wilderness area of the Fire Island National Seashore, which is a national park. And it's an area where they try to keep things as natural as can be and need permits to kind of bring electrical equipment or other things in. So they decided to sort of let this breach or this cut through the barrier island see what it would do naturally. And so they kind of left it alone, and it has, over the past 5 years, presented a pretty good opportunity for scientists to research just the bay and how barrier islands work and sort of what happens here, and perhaps model sort of what might happen in other places in the country where they have similar barrier island systems.
So you're saying they didn't really get to study that?
Well, they did. It became this working lab for them. And so scientists and researchers from Stony Brook, USGS, Army Corps, they have been out sort of studying the breach and the habitat there and sort of what changes they've seen. It's across from Belport Bay. Mm-hmm. So they've measured like salinity levels in the bay, and they found that they increased a little bit. And they found that which means that's sort of an indication of more ocean water coming in and out with the Great South Bay.
Right.
And they also found that there's more migratory fish and more sort of big prey fish. And they found fish and species that like salt water as opposed to fresher water. They're sort of increasing in abundance now. So it's indicating that perhaps that cut in the island is allowing more migration between ocean and bay, and kind of creating a more stable and resilient ecosystem, because the more species that move in and out or around, the more sort of the food web is more complex, and so it can sort of maintain and be more resilient.
Right. Yeah, I tell you, that was the surprising thing for me, reading your story, was I never realized how seemingly closed that ecosystem was.
Well, yeah, I mean, there were 2 inlets. There's Fire Island Inlet, which is pretty big, and then there's Moriches Inlet. And then in the middle is this new inlet, which is in a place where there had been an inlet sort of hundreds of years ago. And it only accounts for, maybe less than 10% of the ocean water that moves in and out of the bay. But it appears, based on surveys that scientists did in 2013, 14, and 15, that there is now more kind of interconnectivity between the ocean and the bay now than there was previously. Right.
And I guess, even though it's kind of changed, they're still looking at that as a good thing because of the resilience of the system now, in case it takes a hit one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, they look at it when there's more diversity of species. It's a ecosystem is more complex and able to kind of stave off disease or overfishing or kind of what could happen. Yeah. But it's still kind of up in the air. They don't know if the breach will open more or if it'll close and what that will mean, and if sort of the number of species that like salt water will increase or if it's kind of hit its equilibrium. It's still very much up in the air and in progress.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, it's really interesting. I grew up on Long Island, so I had relatives out in Quogue, which is a little ways out east. And I can remember as a kid, we would get maybe 5 or 6 of us in a boat and go out at 10 o'clock in the morning, and by noon we would have 2 bushels of clams, enough fish probably to feed 30 people. So we would actually go out fishing for lunch.
So I grew up in Colorado, so that sounds like a magic adventure tour that it would have never existed in my universe. Right. But yeah, a lot of people say that's what they used to do, and there's several programs now where they're kind of seeding the bay with hard-shell clams to see if they can kind of bring back some populations that have been decimated. Right. And there's a lot of research and sort of efforts going on there as well.
Well, I think, and one of the things that I was going to bring up is, I remember my aunts and uncles, if they brought in clams that were too small, they threw them back. back, or they would put them next to the dock where the house was. So they were always kind of reseeding all of these places. They didn't just take it out and, with no consideration. So I always felt like that's why there was always an abundance of this kind of food. Because they were, I guess the word is husbanding.
Yeah, and I think when decades ago, when harmful algal blooms started happening, these really hit a lot of the stocks. So there was a combination of maybe some overfishing and harvesting, and then some invasive blooms that really cut down on the numbers. So that's been something that the researchers have been trying to kind of battle back against as well.
Yeah, well, there's some kind of connection there to the wastewater sewage and treatment plants with the nitrogen and the amount of oxygen. I know that they are supposed to monitor, the levels of things that they're dumping back into the ocean. But those algae blooms, I don't remember that as a kid at all.
Yeah, I think it's sad. I actually do algae bloom stories every year, and I always call the same researcher, and I'm like, it's the same song again. But they've been kind of occurring, for decades now, where they just hadn't been before. And this year they found some cases that were the highest densities they had ever recorded in some areas. So there's a lot of research going into what might be causing this, and there's a lot of effort looking at how to reduce the amount of nitrogen that gets into the waterways by, aging septic systems or runoff from storms or agriculture, fertilizing your lawn. Because you think about it, when you use fertilizer to grow things, and if it rains and that fertilizer gets washed off into the water, then that is feeding the growth of some of these algae blooms. So it's,
Yeah. And I think that was also part of the impetus for, I'm not sure if it was the DEC or the EPA mandated that rainwater had to be collected and treated before it was turned back into the ocean.
I'm not familiar with that, so I shouldn't guess, because I'd probably guess the wrong one.
Well, I just think it's interesting that when I was a kid, you didn't see a problem connected with the closing of beaches and rain.
Did they monitor as much back then, I wonder?
They probably didn't. But I don't know that the volume, just pure population, I don't know that the volume was a problem back then. Yeah,
there's definitely been an explosion in residential growth and development.
Yes, and that's one of my arguments with the developers. They put up buildings and they have all these nice units, but nobody talked about the septic system. And then you come to find out there isn't any. Well, we're just going to connect to the sewers. Well, you got 80 new families here. What do you mean?
Yeah, I know the county is really looking at ways to use advanced on-site wastewater treatment systems to reduce the number of nitrogen and nutrients that get into the water. So it's something that they are definitely focused on.
Yeah, it's just interesting. All of these things are connected, because now, it rains and then they tell you which beaches are open and which ones are closed. And most of that's because the existing sewage treatment plants can't handle the rainwater. The volume just... So, as the water rises, it goes over the top with whatever else happens to be in the mix.
Yeah, you have to think about whatever is on your road or whatever you dump down your drain is eventually going to make it to the waterway. Yeah.
And it's, it is kind of scary. I don't know how many of us can wash our clothes in the river and expect the river to stay unsoapy, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, really... But this is interesting, and this is only, they closed the other two breaches, and it's only one. That's all. And this big change occurred.
Yeah, well, so they were lucky enough that they had some data from a survey, trawl surveys that they had done in the Bay in 2007. So they were able to compare to previous times before the breach and afterward, and they're still, there's been a change, but the numbers on sort of exactly by how much are kind of not yet available, because it's a lot harder to extrapolate out census numbers in smaller areas.
Right.
So the Bay isn't really big enough to do that, but they've definitely noticed that, and they noticed a big increase in lady crabs and a reduction in blue crabs, and that's because lady crabs, they like saltier water than blue crabs. But also blue crabs are fished and harvested, so it's unclear if maybe that was going on because lady crabs aren't particularly, they're not really a commercial fishery.
Right. Interesting. Is there any plan to close that up, or are they just going to expect to leave it alone?
So the Fire Island National Seashore, through the Park Service, has been doing a feasibility study to sort of evaluate their options, and it's still under review. But the plan there's like a take no action, monitor it, and then if it seems like the breach is going to present a problem to the mainland, they'll look at closing it. But no decision has been sort of made yet. I think it's it's still under review.
Yeah, right. And I guess it is kind of difficult to guess the outcome. Whether it's going to be a good thing for, I'm sure there are commercial fishermen around there that have a say, or, maybe they're saying, hey, look, the thing I was fishing is gone, or I have to change what I go after now, or...
Yeah, I haven't much looked into that. I do know when I talk to people who spend a lot of time out there, they say they feel like the water is and looks a lot cleaner than it used to be near the breach area. But you have to remember, it's only about like 10% of the water in and out. Right. That said, it has increased the salinity like in Bellport Bay a bit, right, but it hasn't really changed tide levels or things like that. It made the tides come like a half hour earlier than they used to, but it hasn't had a much big effect on the height of tides. Right. If that makes sense.
Do you think the salinity will have any effect on the algae?
I do not know. That is a good question for scientists. Yeah. I should ask that.
Because I don't know if I've ever seen one of those in a salty, like in the ocean or in an ocean setting.
Well, I think sometimes stagnant water, where there's not a lot of flow going in and out, right, is where they can they can bloom better than in the ocean. Yeah, but right. I imagine that there are occasionally in the ocean. It's just not something I've researched. Yeah. You're giving me something else to do.
Okay. All right. As long as you promise to call us back and let us know what happened.
Of course.
Well, Emily, I thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
I also want to thank Newsday for letting all of you folks in there give us a call and talk about these stories.
We're always happy to.
Great. And thank you very much, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, you too. Take care.
You too.